Good
It's
morning.
it's 2 days after Christmas 2004, isn't it?
It is.
And uh, after much thinking of how I didn't have grandparents tell me what it was like, I decided it was time to capture you before all our memories might disappear. so,
Now, yes, and of course, at my advanced age, I have a photographic memory, but sometimes now it doesn't give me same-day service.
I understand. Isn't that the truth? So I decided I would capture you, and in fact, I've told many people about this, and they thought, what a wonderful idea.
Yeah.
So, what I thought we'd do, since we love the Lord so dearly, let's first give this time to the Lord. Would you mind praying?
Not in the least.
Okay.
Lord, you have been active in our lives in every moment. I recognize now that you were active in my life, leading me, guiding me, seeking me, courting me, long before I was ever aware. Help me now to remember and help us to make a witness to your goodness and your grace as we seek to remember what is past and who it is that we owe so much to. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Well, I gave you a few short lists, but I didn't give you everything, did I?
I'm not concerned about knowing everything in advance. Just let me have your questions and I'll deal with them as best I can.
Okay, I probably should have written out all the things that I wanted to ask, but I didn't. Okay, there's first the pre-Earl time. As much as you know, tell me about what you know about your father and his family background, where they came from, what they did, and of course, we'll go on to the next one briefly. First, let's start with your father.
Well, Earl Chester Langguth was the middle son of three sons. He was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania on the 5th of December 1894. He was the son of Carl Langguth and apparently the grandson of Michael Langguth. And Michael and Carl seem to have been in business together as house painters in Scranton. I have the records from the census of 1900 when my father was 5 years old, and it shows the family and existing as I know they did, with Carl and Fanny as the parents and then the three boys. Sometime after this, probably I would guess at the death of my great-grandfather, Carl and his family relocated to New York City. And they were Seventh-day Adventists, very strict Adventists. According to the story, my great-grandfather Michael came home from a revival about Christmas time. And having been converted to the teachings of Ellen G. White, he came into the house, took their Christmas tree and their Christmas presents and threw them in the street. And from that time on, he was a very strict Adventist. My father apparently had a severe conflict with his father and ran away from home. He told me that he ran away about the age of 12 or 13 to go to sea as a cabin boy, and then he never went back home. I'm not sure that his older brother Ralph would quite have agreed with that memory, but I have no way of deciding one way or the other. At any rate, he ran away without ever completing high school. He ended up in the Navy and became a chief pharmacist mate, which is rather remarkable, I think, when you think about it, because of the lack of schooling that he had. He was a very bright man. He was a master chess player, and there was nothing wrong with his understanding and his grasp of things. I used to come home and present him with thought problems from algebra. Well, of course, he had no knowledge at all of algebra, but he would think about the problem and he would find the answer. I'm not quite sure how he did this, but he was a very bright man. He stayed in the Navy and until he met my mother and married her, and then decided that he didn't want to be going from place to place and from assignment to assignment. So he got his discharge from the Navy and became an employee of the Shell Oil Company. When I knew him from my earliest childhood, he was the yard foreman for Shell. He eventually developed angina, and the Shell Oil decided that they didn't want a man with heart problems, so he was fired and became he bought a cigar stand in the First National Bank building in San Diego, and for a number of years ran that until the bank decided they didn't want such a commercial establishment in the lobby of their building. And he then took a course and became a licensed real estate broker. You could do that in those days. And then discovered that he did not want to be a real estate man. He ended up his life as after a brief time as an assistant tax assessor during tax season in San Diego. Property taxes were big things in those days. He ended up as the night manager of the Armed Services YMCA, and this was his job at the time of his death on the 14th of June, 1954, when he had a coronary and died. He probably died as the result of a lifetime of intensive cigarette smoking. So that, when I was 17, Dr. Fuller, our family doctor, who was also a Seventh-day Adventist, would say to my father, "Earl, if you don't stop smoking, you're going to die." And my father didn't brush that off. He believed it. He thought that Dr. Fuller was a good doctor and knew what he was talking about. And I watched him try to stop smoking and fail. I think I know now why he failed. I think he failed because when he began to smoke as a boy in his early teens, he did it believing that he was disobeying God. And there's a great difference between the problems that we have when we start using narcotics such as nicotine, because it is gratifying to us, or it gives us a sense of pleasure or a sense of release or a sense of escape from anxiety. I think it's fairly easy to deal with this kind of an addiction, a physical addiction. You can go cold turkey and get over it. But when you have done something which you believed was disobeying God. I think this is very dangerous. And I think that he had a spiritual addiction, we might say. That if you want to put it this way, that he had an unclean spirit of rebellion that committed him to the continued use of nicotine. And without some kind of a spiritual deliverance, there wasn't any chance for him to stop, and he couldn't. But I looked at him and I thought, wow, if it's that hard to stop using this stuff, you'd be better off never to start. So I never did.
Okay. Tell me about your mother and her family background, where they came from and what they did.
Okay. My mother was born in Southampton in England to Kate Price, who married an Arthur Webster. Now, Kate Price was from a Nottingham family that had been involved in lace making for generations. And I don't quite know what Arthur did, but he was involved in some kind of an office or some kind of enterprise. I have a Bible that was given to him when he left the employment of one company to go to another one, or to do whatever it was that he did. But whatever it was, he died of disease when my mother was 3 years old. And so his wife packed up the 4 children and went to California, where her brother and her mother were, in a little mining town called Julian. So my mother was uprooted from Southampton and taken as the youngest child at the age of 3 to live in this British colony in a mining town in Southern California. And so my mother's earliest memories were of being on the ranch and riding horses and being a California girl, a cowgirl, as it were. Her great ambition was to spend her life breaking horses to the saddle. That's what she wanted to do. But everyone around her spoke in such British tones. I think it even invaded the high school. I don't think there was anyone there except the boy that she noted who at an assembly once gave a demonstration of chemistry, and who addressed the assembled parents by saying, you put this here stuff in that there test tube, but which amused her greatly. But all during her life, all you had to do is to hear her speak, and strangers would say to her, "Oh, you're English, aren't you?" It infuriated her. She was not English. She was a California cowgirl. But she spoke with this very educated English accent. And I'm afraid she communicated some of this to me because your mother and I had an ongoing debate for almost half a century about what it was you heated water in on the stove. She said you heated it in a saucepan. And I, of course, found that to be ridiculous because everybody knows that you used a saucepan. She grew up in Julian. She faced the realities of life and came to San Diego and took a course in a commercial college to learn to be a typist and a bookkeeper. And so this was her vocation. When at the time that she met my father, she was a bookkeeper for Fry and Smith printers in San Diego. And so she met him. She had been engaged to a man previously, obviously I think very much in love, but the man had become psychotic. he had had a nervous breakdown, and he had to be hospitalized, and finally it was plain that he was never going to be well, and the engagement was broken off. And my guess is that on the rebound, she and Earl Chester Langguth became engaged. They were married on the 22nd of August 1922 in San Diego in her Episcopal church. Now the great problem, of course, was that her family was originally Anglican. She was an Episcopalian, and when she was a child, one of her uncles had become really involved in the Baptist church in Julian. And he became especially religious. And one day they came out into the barn and found him hanging by his neck. He had committed suicide. And this induced a fear of excessive religiousness in Kathleen Webster, and it carried over, of course, into Kathleen Langguth. So her idea was, well, of course church is a good idea, but don't become a fanatic.
Uh-huh.
And I had a member of my church here in Grass Valley who defined the word fanatic, I think, as well as anybody ever has. A fanatic is someone who loves the Lord more than I do. Mother was perfectly willing to come to church as soon as the service was over, she could quit the premises and go home and not have to stand around and talk to people.
Mm-hmm.
And she was rather concerned when her son became involved in the ministry. This was not something that was at all desirable either for her or for my father. My father believed that any group of people who A, worshipped on Sunday, B, had professional paid clergy, or C, had their clergy trained in seminaries and got degrees like D.D. My father said, "Yea, they are all dumb dogs." That was scriptural for him. These were the Antichrist. Christians would meet on the Jewish Sabbath. They would have a person leading them on the Sabbath that had a normal job the rest of the week, and certainly they would never have had a seminary training. So that, and my mother, of course, believed that you had a priest, you used the Book of Common Prayer, and you certainly expected the priest to have had considerable academic preparation. There was no possibility of calmly discussing anything about religion in our household. It just never happened. When it became obvious that there was a child to be expected, and I'll have to tell you the story of that, they had a formal peace treaty, and they entered into an agreement that when the child was born, whatever it was, he or she was to be permitted to make his own or her own decisions, and that neither of them would try to influence them. That was not always adhered to, as we'll hear. But apparently my mother believed, and effectively, that one could engage in sexual relations with her husband without fear of pregnancies, as soon as the activity was over, she would go out and have a douche of hot water, which would wash away the possibility of impregnation. And the story that I have been told, and was told by my mother, was that they were living out in a little cottage at Pacific Beach, and Kate Webster, my mother's mother, my grandmother, had come to visit. So everyone had gone to bed. My parents were in their bedroom, or of course they weren't my parents at the time. And Kate was in her room, but Kate found it difficult to get to sleep. So she came out into the kitchen, and there on the stove was a kettle of water heating, and she said to herself, "How wonderful it is, my daughter Kathleen is preparing water for tea." So she made herself a cup of tea. And presently my mother comes bolting out of the bedroom to find that there is no hot water. 40 weeks later, I was born. That's the story.
One of the questions I've got is, what was the world like at the time that they, their early years, before you came along? Now, obviously, we're talking time period, what, between 1890s and
well, my mother
1920s?
was born in 1894, the 18th of May, 1894. She was about 6 months older, give or take, than her husband. I'm not sure that I know that much about the world before World War One. It was a different world. I have collected silver-plated teaspoons from before 1911 because I felt that somehow the whole nature of our culture changed about 1911. And things were different after that than they were before. It's hard for me to go back that far. The 1920s, of course, were a time of when women were beginning to explore the possibilities of liberation. They were getting the vote. My mother became a citizen of the United States by marrying my father. Congress passed a law in 1922 that said that beginning the 1st of September of that year, it was no longer possible to become a naturalized American citizen by marrying an American citizen, a native-born American citizen. And it was always interesting because my mother would say that she had become a citizen by marrying my father, and they always asked immediately, "Well, when were you married?" Well, she was married the 22nd of August, before the 1st of September. So she just got in under the wire. But women were now voting for the first time. This was a time when the Democratic Party was more conservative in a sense than the Republicans were. The Democrats were kind of land-oriented, and interested in labor and miners and all of this sort of thing. And they weren't very successful in seeking the White House. The first Democratic president after Woodrow Wilson was Franklin D. Roosevelt. In the years in between, it was one Republican after another, and this was the time of the flappers. This is the jazz age. This is the time of music I know a lot about from this period of time, because my parents had a collection of records which were the only records I had to play on my little wind-up Victrola when I was a child, and so I played them. So
What did they especially like to listen to?
Oh, I love to listen to those ragtime and kind of orchestrated jazz records. I love to listen to the Two Black Crows and to Gallagher and Sheen. I love to listen to Harry Lauder. All of these things were very wonderful. There were some McCormick records. There was even a Caruso record or two. And it was very interesting. Music played an important part of my life very early. And it's always played an important part of my life. My mother was very musical. She had songs that she sang. One of her songs, this reflects an attitude that I find peculiar in a woman. I'll sing it for you.
Okay.
I sent my wife to the Thousand Isles, hooray! She won't be home for quite a while. She'll spend a week on every isle, hooray! Which, there was an undercurrent in my mother's thinking and the things that she enjoyed, an undercurrent of hostility toward men and hostility toward marriage, hostility toward women that I never quite understood. I don't understand it now. She wasn't, well, let's say something right here. My parents were not affectionate. I cannot remember any occasion in which I ever saw my parents physically express any kind of affection. They didn't kiss, they didn't hold hands, they relationships between them seemed to be a kind of a relationship of wary uneasiness, of kind of a restless truce that they had of some kind. And so it was not altogether a comfortable household in which to grow up. As a matter of fact, there were many times in my childhood, in my remembered childhood, beginning in the house on Pennsylvania Avenue, when I would go to bed fearful that when I awoke the next morning, I would only have one parent there, that the other parent would have decamped. It never happened, but I always felt it was on the verge of happening. And it was particularly acute when I would get sick, because my father was always insisting that I ought to be taken to the Adventist sanitarium. They would be able to fix me. And my mother was always absolutely opposed to this. So I was a sickly child, as a young child, and this kind of crisis arose again and again, and my parents couldn't agree.